Today we are going to talk about food. The one thing we all love, the one thing we all need, and for many of us, the one thing we struggle with the most. Nothing has caused me more stress and frustration than food, and apparently I'm not alone. According to recent data, between 40 and 50% of adults globally are overweight, and that number jumps to roughly 70% in North America. And since weight gain is the direct result of consuming more energy than your body needs, that means that most people struggle controlling their food intake. And it's definitely not due to a lack of trying or motivation, because let's be real, although some people aren't that bothered by their weight, most people are, and many are actively trying to lose it. So maybe people just don't know how to lose weight. I don't think that's the issue either. Even if the traditional weight loss advice of eat less, move more is an oversimplification, it's not wrong, and most well-known weight loss diets can work. So if people want to lose weight and know how to lose weight, then why do so many still struggle to do it? The real problem isn't a lack of knowledge or motivation, but rather it's the inability to control behavior. It's the fact that most people, despite their best intentions, just can't seem to stop eating. Chances are you've been there before, likely more times than you can count. You eat even though you're not physically hungry, maybe even to the point where you feel physically sick. And after the guilt, shame, and fear of weight gain set in, you promise yourself that this is the last time. Starting tomorrow, you'll get back on track with a healthy diet. But within days, maybe even hours, the cycle repeats itself. And the worst part, you have no idea why or how to stop. If this is something you can relate to, you are definitely not alone. For millions of people, this is a daily battle. And just over 5 years ago now, that was my life too. I struggled with severe binge eating and other food-related issues for the majority of my life up until that point. So while I am at my ideal weight now, getting here was far from easy. I have a full video dedicated to my entire health and fitness journey if you're interested, but long story short, binge eating basically consumed and controlled my life for a very long time. And overcoming it was by far the hardest thing I've ever been through. Weight loss is already hard, but what made it even harder was the lack of genuinely helpful information available. And it hasn't really changed since then. There's definitely no shortage of weight loss advice, but very few resources offer real solutions for those who are truly struggling with food. On the one side, you have fitness influencers, who have never truly struggled with food or weight, by the way, pushing extreme, unsustainable diets. And when you inevitably fail to stick to them, well, it's not because their advice is wrong, it's because you're lazy, or you just don't want it bad enough. And on the other side, you have the ED recovery community, which actively shuts down conversations about weight loss altogether. And this is extremely unfortunate, because these are the people, along with other educated professionals in the nutrition space, who should be the ones providing healthy weight loss advice. And yet, the majority just dismiss the value of weight loss goals altogether, labeling them as toxic diet culture. For them, it's all about learning to accept your body and eat intuitively. Their main mantra is just listen to your body. But what if your body is continuously telling you to overeat or binge? Don't get me wrong, learning to be more accepting of your body and focusing less on weight loss is definitely the right path for some people. But for me, it simply wasn't. And not just because I wanted to look a certain way or be a certain type of person on the outside, but because I wanted to feel a certain way and be a certain type of person on the inside. I wanted to be someone who felt strong, confident, and capable, and someone who could trust themselves to follow through on the things that truly mattered to them. But I couldn't do that. I felt completely out of control and powerless around food. And when I turned to the ED community for help, I was made to feel even more powerless. Like I wasn't capable of achieving my health and fitness goals even if I wanted to. Like I was too disordered and broken to control something as basic and essential as food. And that just never sat right with me, because deep down, I knew I was capable of more. Of course, everyone wants and needs different things, but for me, overcoming this struggle was the one thing I always wanted. And I knew I would never truly be happy until I was able to do so, which is why I never truly gave up on my weight loss goals, despite how impossible it felt at the time. I tried absolutely everything to gain control of food. Different diets and lifestyle strategies, even therapy and coaching, but nothing worked for me. No matter what I did, I just kept falling back into the same patterns. After exhausting traditional methods, I realized that, unfortunately, no one else had the answers for me. And if I wanted to break free from binge eating for good, I'd have to figure it out myself. So that's exactly what I set out to do. Of course, it was far from easy, but after years of research, self-experimentation, and a formal education in psychology, I finally understood why I was struggling with food, and most importantly, how to get myself to stop. I've been completely binge-free for over 5 years now, and I've maintained my ideal weight ever since. While I often wish I didn't have to struggle as much as I did, I learned so much throughout that journey, not just about food and weight loss, but about behavior change in general. And at least now, I can help others do the same, which is exactly what I'm going to do in this video. I've learned from countless sources over the years, but no single resource ever gave me the full picture. I had to piece everything together like a puzzle, combining insights from different books, theories, and my own personal experience. And that's exactly why I know how valuable this information is. There isn't a single resource I'm aware of that breaks down overeating and binge eating the way I'm about to in this video. But first, a necessary disclaimer. While I am highly educated and experienced in this area, this is still a very serious topic, and the insights I share in this video could have life-altering consequences, likely for the better, but it's still crucial to think critically for yourself and consult professionals as needed. That being said, like I mentioned earlier, many so-called professionals were never able to help me, and probably made my issues a lot worse. They either had absolutely no idea what they were talking about, or their advice just didn't apply to me. And you may be the same. Everyone has different goals and values, yet this is something that's completely overlooked by most health professionals. So, before we get into it, let me be clear about exactly who this video is for. This video is not for people who just want to be told to accept where they're at or are okay with giving up their health and fitness goals. This video is for people who truly want change and who know they are capable of more. People who are ready to take full control of their weight and eating habits for good. So, the first step to overcoming any problematic behavior is understanding why you engage in it in the first place. So that is what this video is going to focus on. When it comes to disordered eating behaviors, such as binge eating, many people are led to believe that the solution requires fixing all of their underlying psychological problems. For example, in traditional therapy, it's very common to be told that your ED is not about food, but instead due to some sort of past trauma or unresolved emotional wound. And until these issues are resolved, you'll likely continue struggling with binge eating. I want to argue that this simply isn't true. Not only because binge eating often exists without the presence of significant psychological problems at all, but mainly because, at its core, binge eating and overeating in general are behavioral problems. And while related psychological problems may exist, they are not the direct cause of binge eating. In other words, there is no clear, direct link between past trauma or emotional issues and binge eating. If that was the case, that would mean that everyone with past trauma binge eats, which definitely isn't true. Therefore, while I still think it can be valuable, focusing too much on deep underlying emotional issues can quickly turn into an endless distraction from real solutions, and at worst, can become an excuse to delay taking action. It's like any other substance addiction. An addict doesn't need to figure out exactly why they started or fix everything wrong in their lives in order to recover. Often that's just impossible to do anyway. They just need to stop doing the thing they're addicted to, and then they're no longer an addict. Similarly, you don't need to fix every emotional problem in your life to stop binge eating. You just need to stop the behavior of binge eating. And once you do, all of your seemingly related psychological problems become irrelevant. But this still requires addressing the direct cause of the behavior. So if underlying psychological problems aren't the direct cause, then what is? The direct cause of binge eating, at the most fundamental level, is choosing to give into urges to binge. What do I mean when I say urges to binge? Essentially, urges to binge consists of any thought or feeling that compels you to binge eat. And this can look a lot of different ways. Sometimes urges are obvious and intense, like an overwhelming craving that makes you feel like you need to eat more, while other times they're more subtle, like a passing thought about how nice it would be to eat more. But no matter how they appear, they all lead to the same behavior by definition. So practically speaking, they can be treated in the same way. So, urges to binge are the main problem. Every single binge is preceded by an urge to binge in some way, shape, or form. If you didn't experience urges, you simply wouldn't have any reason to binge. However, urges alone don't fully explain binge eating, and that's because binge eating still requires an action. And since eating is a voluntary action, that means we must choose to binge eat. And this is where a lot of people resist, because while binge eating is technically a choice, it often doesn't feel like one. But that's simply because of how overwhelming and uncomfortable urges can feel. It's the presence of urges that explains why we choose to binge eat despite not truly wanting to. Even if we could choose otherwise, it often feels impossible, or at least way too difficult. Put simply, urges to binge are very uncomfortable, and choosing to binge is what relieves this discomfort. So, the cause of binge eating ultimately involves two main components: the presence of urges and choice. So before we get too deep into the role that choice plays, let's focus on urges and why we have them in the first place. First off, one of the most important things to understand is that having urges doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. In fact, urges are a completely natural and evolved function of the human brain, and they have two primary causes. The first and most straightforward cause is survival cues. In other words, urges can be a biological response to real or perceived food restriction. Our brain is wired for survival, and we need food to live. So when the brain senses a lack of food, it increases hunger and cravings to get us to eat more. And the more food our brain perceives it needs, the stronger these signals become. Without this mechanism in place at all, we simply wouldn't survive. So in the right context, urges are actually beneficial to us. However, the brain can't tell the difference between true restriction and self-imposed restriction, like when we're dieting. This is why many serious binge eating problems, including my own, begin shortly after a period of weight loss or extreme food restriction. The body pushes us to eat as much as possible to restore homeostasis. However, this isn't always the case. Binge eating issues aren't always preceded by food restriction. Urges can also become learned responses to various cues, even in the absence of food restriction. And this occurs through two main types of learning. The first is reinforcement learning. Binge eating and eating in general provides significant rewards beyond survival, such as short-term pleasure and emotional relief, which over time reinforce the behavior and make urges to binge stronger. This is especially true with hyper-palatable foods, which are designed to be as rewarding as possible. Just like any addiction, our brain starts associating these foods with pleasure, which reinforces the desire to seek them out again and again. The second is associative learning, aka classical conditioning. In essence, neutral cues, such as specific foods, places, and so on, can become conditioned cues, aka triggers for binge eating, if they are repeatedly paired with binge eating. For example, if you always binge on a certain food or in a certain location, over time, the brain starts associating that specific food or location with binge eating. And as a result, whenever you encounter that cue again, urges to binge automatically arise. So overall, this means that urges to binge can exist even when more food isn't beneficial for survival, which explains why many people continue struggling with binge eating even after returning to normal eating patterns or regaining weight. While binge eating may begin as a survival response, over time, learned rewards and associations can turn it into something much more. And in many cases, they are the sole reason binge eating develops in the first place. In fact, this is the case for most people who struggle with obesity. Essentially, binge eating can become a deeply ingrained habit, which some may call an addiction. So clearly, while binge eating evolved as a survival response, it obviously isn't necessary for survival. In both cases, the brain is sending the wrong signal, either mistakenly perceiving starvation when no real threat exists, or reinforcing rewards that have nothing to do with survival at all. In other words, you can think of urges to binge as survival drives gone wrong. But this begs the question, if our brain is wired for survival, why would it push us towards behaviors that drive us in the opposite direction? The key thing to understand is that urges to binge come from very primitive brain structures, which I'll collectively refer to from now on as the lower brain. These are the same brain structures we've had for thousands of years and are very similar to other animals. At one point, every urge we experience today did serve a survival purpose. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been passed down at all. This is simply how evolution and natural selection work. Take the basic drive to eat. In hunter-gatherer times, food was scarce and unpredictable. So those who were more driven to seek out food and capable of eating large amounts when it was available had a survival advantage. Storing excess energy during periods of abundance was crucial for surviving times of scarcity, making the feast or famine response an adaptive trait. The problem now is that there is a massive discrepancy between the speed natural selection takes place and the speed our food environment changed. Natural selection occurs over thousands to millions of years, while our food environment has drastically transformed in just a few centuries. What this means is that the lower brain hasn't changed significantly since ancient times, but our environment and the goals we possess have changed significantly. Not only is food more readily available, but it's also much more processed and calorically dense. So while the drive to overeat calorically dense food may have been beneficial back in the day, it's now counterproductive, which explains why the lower brain pushes us toward behaviors that no longer serve us. Put simply, the behaviors that once benefited survival do not necessarily benefit survival now, and the lower brain is too primitive to recognize that. And to make matters even worse, the food we have access to isn't just more calorically dense. It's literally designed to overstimulate our reward centers. The exact same reward centers that become hijacked in substance addiction. Just think about it. If a deadly substance can hijack the brain and convince it that it's necessary for survival, then it should be obvious how food, something that's actually beneficial for survival, could do the same. This is why people who push intuitive eating as a solution for overeating and binge eating bother me so much. It's like telling an addict that the best way to recover is to just listen to their body. Sure, some people's brains can regulate food intake just fine, but this video isn't for them. And I would also argue that this is not the norm. Just think of the obesity stats I mentioned earlier. For many of us, especially those with a history of binge eating and food addiction, intuitive eating is almost the exact opposite of what we should be doing, at least in the beginning. Furthermore, whether survival drives are truly beneficial or not, they can still conflict with what I call higher order goals, such as wanting to become a high-level athlete or compete in a physique competition, even just wanting to look your best. These goals aren't always the healthiest or best for survival, yet many people still deem them worth pursuing. And this is where things get really interesting, because if you take a step back, the ability to have higher order goals to begin with is quite unusual. And by unusual, I mean in comparison to most animals. Most animals simply act on impulse and survival drives. If they're hungry, they eat. If they're tired, they sleep. It's not like a lion debates whether it should hunt for food or fast for health benefits. And that's because, unlike other animals, human beings develop something quite special and unique. A completely different brain region known as the prefrontal cortex, which I'm simply going to refer to as the higher brain. And although this is an oversimplification, since the brain obviously has many different regions and is quite complex, we can essentially break the human brain down into two main areas: the lower brain and the higher brain. And these two brain areas function completely differently. The lower brain is responsible for generating survival drives and reinforcing habits that provide instant gratification. But it cannot consider long-term consequences of behavior. The higher brain, on the other hand, can. The higher brain is what allows us to recognize that just because we want something in the moment doesn't mean it's what's best for us overall. And this awareness is what allows us to set higher order goals in the first place. This means that the part of the brain responsible for generating higher order goals is distinct from the part of the brain that generates survival drives. And it's the presence of these two distinct brain areas that explains why we have conflicting desires. It's the all too familiar battle between instant and delayed gratification. The feeling that we don't truly want to do something, but our body is pushing us toward it anyway. Well, this explains why, and is the main reason why problems like binge eating exist. The lower brain recognizes the short-term rewards of binge eating and produces a desire to binge, while the higher brain recognizes the long-term consequences of binge eating and produces a desire to stop. In short, the desire to binge comes from the lower brain, while the desire to stop comes from the higher brain. Thankfully, though, the higher brain doesn't just give us the desire to stop. It also gives us the ability to. Remember when we defined the cause of binge eating as the choice to give in to urges? Well, this is where choice comes into play. Because beyond simply recognizing the problem, the higher brain allows us to actively inhibit the lower brain. In other words, we possess the ability to choose actions that go completely against our survival drives. And in fact, this is exactly why the higher brain evolved in the first place. If simply following instinct was enough to maximize survival, we wouldn't have benefited from higher order thinking at all. We evolved the higher brain because the lower brain simply wasn't as effective on its own. And this is what makes human beings so much more advanced than other animals. We don't just react to urges. We have the ability to think critically about the future, reflect on the past, and act with intention. And the best part is, this isn't just possible sometimes. It's always possible. The higher brain is always in control, at least when it comes to conscious, voluntary behavior. While you can't always control how you feel, hence the presence of urges, you can always control how you respond. So, although it may not feel like it sometimes, binge eating is always a choice. It's the choice made by the higher brain to obey the urges generated by the lower brain. Now that we fully understand the cause of binge eating, we can figure out how to stop. Since binge eating is the direct result of choosing to give in to urges to binge, this means there are only two ways to stop. The first is to eliminate urges. Like I said, if the lower brain doesn't produce urges to binge in the first place, there would simply be no reason to binge. The second is to not act on urges. Once again, since binge eating is a choice, this means you do not need to eliminate urges in order to stop. Urges may be uncomfortable, but you can still choose not to act on them. So while you can think of the first way as weakening the lower brain, you can think of the second way as strengthening the higher brain. However, it goes without saying that the second method seems a lot harder than the first. Instead of eliminating discomfort, it requires facing it head on. And this is exactly why most proposed solutions to binge eating focus on the first method, eliminating urges altogether. And how do they attempt to do that? Well, let's go back to why we have urges in the first place: survival cues and learned cues. Since there are two main causes of binge urges, there are also two main ways to eliminate them. The first is to avoid survival cues. In other words, avoid food restriction. This is what most nutrition-based strategies aim to accomplish, as well as intuitive eating and other anti-diet approaches. When it comes down to it, the goal is to prevent the excessive hunger and cravings that lead to binge eating. The second is to avoid learned cues. In other words, avoid binge triggers. For example, many food addiction models treat hyperpalatable foods as the direct cause of urges, and therefore promote abstaining from those foods entirely. Therapy techniques take a similar approach, but focus on reducing the negative emotions that lead to binge urges. And then there are environmental strategies, like removing junk food from the house, which is something you've all probably heard before. All of these methods aim to eliminate urges by avoiding the cues that trigger them in the first place. Eliminating urges may seem like the more straightforward solution, but there are several problems with this approach. Now, this is where you need to pay extra attention, because realizing this was one of the first main steps in me finally being able to overcome my binge eating issues for good. The key thing to realize is that while these strategies can be very helpful and are absolutely worth implementing to some extent, they are not, and can never be, the true solution to binge eating. And there are three main reasons why. The first reason is that trying to avoid cues is simply impossible, or at least very ineffective. Take food restriction cues. Avoiding them won't eliminate urges that are driven by habit, which is almost always the primary driver of persistent binge eating issues. Once again, this is why quitting dieting and eating more food was never enough to solve my own binge eating issues, and honestly made them worse. And as for avoiding all of your triggers, like hyperpalatable foods, this is nearly impossible in the modern environment. Unless you're okay with isolating yourself from the world entirely, you simply can't be in control of every situation. Exposure to hyperpalatable foods, negative emotions, and other triggers is simply inevitable. So, if eliminating urges isn't even possible to begin with, it obviously can't be the solution. But even if it was possible, there are still two main problems. The second main problem is that trying to avoid cues is counterproductive, as it minimizes your sense of self-control. As we just discussed, cues can trigger binge urges, but binge urges do not necessitate binge eating. You can always choose not to act on them. But if you don't truly believe this, and instead believe that you need to avoid food restriction or certain foods in order to stop binge eating, this can create an unnecessary fear of those cues, which reduces your sense of self-control and can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. In other words, if you believe food restriction or certain foods are causing your binge eating, you may subconsciously use this belief as an excuse to continue binge eating when you happen to go without food or are around certain foods. Like I've said several times in previous videos, if you don't truly believe you can change, why would you even try? The last and probably most significant reason is that trying to avoid cues often conflicts with meaningful higher order goals. Consider someone who wants to stop binge eating because they want to lose weight, but they're told that the solution to their binge eating is to avoid all forms of food restriction and dieting. Since weight loss requires being in a caloric deficit, arguably a form of food restriction, eliminating all food restriction would make weight loss impossible. And this is a big problem because weight loss is one of the most common motivations for people who want to stop binge eating. Just think about it. If weight wasn't a concern at all, why would anyone want to stop overeating or binge eating in the first place? It just doesn't make sense. In short, if you believe you must avoid food restriction to avoid binge eating, you may also believe that weight loss is impossible. And if you believe that weight loss is impossible, your motivation to stop binge eating may disappear entirely. And when it comes to avoiding certain triggers, like hyperpalatable foods, this can interfere with other meaningful goals, such as maintaining a healthy social life, or simply wanting to have a normal relationship with food. Hence, even if approaches like abstinence did eliminate urges, would it even be worth it? It may be for some people, but it definitely wouldn't be for me. I'm a massive foodie, and I simply don't want to live in fear of the foods I enjoy. To summarize, not only is trying to get rid of urges ineffective and harmful to self-control, but it can also undermine the very goals that motivate us to stop binge eating in the first place. So, this leads us to the true solution for binge eating. If eliminating urges is both unnecessary and unproductive, then the only other way to stop binge eating is to stop acting on urges. As we discussed, the lower brain can generate uncomfortable thoughts and feelings that compel you to binge, but it cannot directly cause you to binge. Only the higher brain controls voluntary behavior, including all eating behavior, meaning you can always choose not to binge. And if you're still skeptical of this, just imagine a very high-stakes scenario. What if someone told you that if you go the next 3 days without eating anything, you'd win $1 billion? Going without food for 3 whole days is much more extreme than simply not binge eating. And yet, there is absolutely no doubt you'd be able to do it. If the rewards of not binge eating feel important enough to you, more important than the desire for instant gratification, you simply won't binge eat. This alone proves that eating is within your control, and that the real challenge isn't physical limitations, but mental limitations. There are a couple caveats I want to mention though. The first has to do with the value of minimizing urges rather than eliminating them completely. Once again, although eliminating urges is ultimately ineffective, you can still try to minimize them and make the process of recovery as comfortable as possible. For example, even if avoiding food restriction isn't enough to prevent urges entirely, it's still extremely important to prioritize proper nutrition and avoid unnecessarily restricting your calorie intake, especially when you're in the initial stages of overcoming binge eating. Similarly, you can still try to reduce urges triggered by hyperpalatable foods by managing your food environment or keeping certain foods out of the house. At the very least, knowing what triggers your urges can help you stay more aware and prepared for when you do encounter them. However, this still does not mean that you need to or should avoid them. It may make the process a bit easier, but the primary goal should be developing the ability to handle all urges confidently, without needing to avoid them. The second caveat is that while embracing urges may sound like it would be harder than just trying to get rid of them, it's actually the opposite. It may sound counterintuitive, but remember, binge eating, especially reward-based binge eating, is nothing more than a very powerful habit, and habits can change. So although not binge eating will take deliberate effort at first, it will get easier and more automatic over time, but only if you're willing to experience urges first. And there are 2 main mechanisms behind this. Number 1, not acting on urges in itself will result in the elimination of urges over time. As binge eating stops being reinforced, the association between urges to binge and the reward of binge eating will gradually be unlearned, and the urges will subside. In essence, the brain stops wasting energy on producing urges and discomfort that no longer leads to any sort of reward. Secondly, even if urges do not entirely subside, the way you habitually respond to them will change. Just like repeatedly giving into urges causes giving into urges to become a habit, repeatedly not giving into urges causes not giving into urges to become a habit. You will therefore have two things working in your favor: less urges and better control over your urges. So even if you do believe that exerting the self-control to not act on urges is unsustainable long-term, that's totally fine, because it's not something you'll have to do forever. To summarize, the true cure for binge eating is learning how to not act on urges to binge. And the first step in actually being able to do so is accepting and embracing this very fact. But this begs the ultimate question. If not acting on urges is the solution to binge eating, how do we actually do that? Because clearly it's easier said than done. And to understand why, we need to take a slightly closer look at how the lower brain influences the higher brain. While the lower brain is irrational, it's also incredibly influential and persuasive. And it makes resisting urges difficult in two main ways. The first is by producing uncomfortable physical sensations, aka feelings. As we've all probably experienced, urges to binge often come with overwhelming feelings of discomfort, ranging from strong hunger cues and cravings to restlessness or even physical agitation. And while these feelings aren't necessarily signs that something is actually wrong or that you need to eat, without knowing this in advance, it's almost impossible to tell. When we have an urge to binge, all we know is that the discomfort feels unbearable, creating a false sense of urgency that makes binge eating seem like the only way to find relief. The even bigger challenge, however, are cognitive distortions, aka thoughts, which simply refer to any biased or irrational thought patterns. These thought patterns can warp your perception of what you truly want and create a mental environment where unhealthy behaviors like binge eating feel justified or even necessary. How is this possible? Well, the key thing to understand is that not all of our thoughts are intentional. In fact, most aren't. Most of our thoughts are automatically generated based on past experiences, just like habits. And these are the kinds of thoughts that the lower brain can use to convince us to binge. For example, if you've ever justified binge eating with thoughts like, "one more time won't hurt," "I'll start fresh tomorrow," or "I have no control, so what's the point of trying anyway?" your brain will start associating these thoughts with the reward of binge eating, causing them to automatically resurface in the future. So, although the lower brain doesn't think logically like the higher brain, it can still generate logical sounding thoughts. And if you aren't aware of this, it becomes extremely difficult to distinguish between rational thoughts and thoughts generated by the lower brain. But despite how difficult it feels, knowing this actually makes the solution quite straightforward. It all comes down to developing higher order mindset skills, shifting your beliefs, being able to recognize the lower brain, and outsmarting cognitive distortions, all of which put you back in control of your behavior. Of course, this doesn't mean it's easy, but it is more than possible. Many people believe that self-control is something you either have or you don't, but that's simply not true. Self-control is a skill, and just like any other skill, can be learned and strengthened over time. But in order to do that, you need to know how. And unfortunately, practical resources on self-control, especially when it comes to food, are extremely rare. Most advice either oversimplifies the problem or completely misses what it actually takes to dismiss urges in the moment. Like I said, this is something I had to figure out on my own, but luckily for you, this means you don't have to. After years of research and experience, I identified the key mindset shifts and strategies needed to create lasting behavior change. A complete structured approach to overcoming binge eating and other problematic behaviors for good. And in the next video of this series, I'm going to walk you through that process step by step. Importantly though, everything I covered in this video is the essential first step in that process. Before you can fully implement the system, you need to understand why you're implementing it. And now you do. So, if you're ready to take the next step in changing your behavior, definitely make sure you are subscribed to my channel and stay tuned for my next video, where I'll be breaking down a complete system for lasting behavior change. One that will help you take control of your habits and overcome binge eating for good. See you guys then.